Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you. Henry and Martha lived in the lovely Foxglove Estates, a 55-plus community that prided itself on pristine lawns, uniform mailboxes, and meticulously enforced quiet hours. They'd moved in a few years prior, hoping to settle down into a simpler life after decades of hard work. Sure, the monthly HOA fees were steep, and certain rules felt a bit overreaching, but for the most part, they'd felt secure in their tidy little cul-de-sac. All of that changed when a new president took over the HOA, Karen Wilmorn. She introduced herself with polished nails, a stiff smile, and a binder bursting with revised rules and guidelines. Residents were used to mild changes here and there, maybe an update on trash collection times, but Karen's new rules went beyond the usual: no flags of any kind other than the standard American flag, no more than 3 potted plants on porches, and cars could not be parked in the driveway for more than 2 hours if they weren't brand new models from the last 5 years. Many of the older neighbors simply laughed, chalking it up to the new president's overenthusiasm. They assumed she'd calm down once she realized how outlandish these demands were. But Karen was dead serious. She began surveying each home with a clipboard, taking pictures of violations and passing out yellow slips that resembled parking tickets. If you'd left your trash can out a minute past pickup time, you'd receive a notice. If you dared to have a decorative wreath that wasn't seasonally appropriate, you'd get another. And heaven forbid you plant anything that wasn't on her color-coordinated list of approved flora. Henry and Martha were relatively rule-abiding. They were the types who liked to keep their yard immaculate. Martha took pride in her roses, Henry trimmed their hedges like a topiary artist. It was a hobby that kept their spirits up. However, they did have one long-standing tradition. Each spring, they placed 2 pink flamingo lawn ornaments in memory of their honeymoon in Florida decades ago. It was a quirky, silly gesture that always made them smile. Since they only displayed them from March until May, it had never been an issue, until Karen. One sunny April morning, Martha came out with her watering can to find 2 large orange notices pinned to the flamingos. According to the citations, they were in violation of the newly instituted aesthetic guidelines. Martha frowned and tossed the notices in the trash, assuming Karen might just give them a pass if she explained the flamingos' sentimental purpose. But that afternoon, Henry found a second violation on their front door, stapled and taped with glaring, bold lettering. It demanded that the flamingos be removed immediately or they'd incur a fine. Any refusal to comply would be grounds for a hearing in front of the HOA board. The situation escalated quickly. Within a week, Henry and Martha were receiving daily warnings. Each letter became more severe, threatening fines, then legal fees, and finally possible eviction procedures. The notion that a sweet, older couple could be forced to sell their home, especially over 2 decorative flamingos, sounded absurd. Word spread among their neighbors. Some thought the new HOA president was punishing them specifically. Others worried they'd be next. Someone had received a citation for having a politically themed welcome mat. Another was cited for hanging a small, decorative wind chime. The atmosphere in Foxglove Estates shifted from peace to paranoia. People whispered on driveways, glancing nervously around like they feared Karen would pop out with her clipboard at any moment. Martha started losing sleep, anxious about every small detail of their house. Were their curtains too brightly colored? Could that be considered aesthetically disruptive? Then, Henry decided to push back. He typed out a polite letter to Karen, explaining that the flamingos held special meaning. He offered a compromise: they could keep them up only 1 week each April, the week of their anniversary, if that would satisfy the HOA. No response. Instead, they got a thicker envelope in their mailbox, an official summons. Karen had not only filed a formal complaint with the HOA board but had also apparently contacted the local police about a trespassing and vandalism incident. According to Karen's claim, Henry had ripped a "No Flamingos" sign off her front gate and verbally threatened her in the process. To Henry's and Martha's utter disbelief, a police cruiser arrived one morning, lights swirling. 2 officers politely asked Henry to step outside. They questioned him about the alleged vandalism. He was dumbfounded. He had never even walked onto Karen's property, let alone threatened her. The officers seemed unsure. They took his statement and left. But the mere presence of law enforcement caused neighbors to watch from their porches. Rumors swirled. Karen's story mutated with each retelling. Some claimed Henry had threatened to sue, others said he'd screamed about constitutional rights in the middle of the street. Suddenly, the pink flamingos were at the center of a neighborhood controversy that was anything but quaint. What had once been a gentle retirement community started feeling like a war zone, with neighbors afraid to speak up. Then came the big bombshell. A letter arrived from an actual law firm representing the HOA, claiming Henry and Martha owed $3,000 in fines and legal fees. If they didn't pay and remove the flamingos, Karen would push for an immediate court order to seize the property. It was a shocking sum. They weren't wealthy by any means. They lived on their combined pensions, carefully budgeting month to month. The stress was mounting, and Martha's health started to suffer. The entire ordeal felt surreal, like a bizarre nightmare. Eventually, Henry decided it was time to stand his ground. He reached out to a pro bono organization that specialized in defending senior citizens against predatory HOA practices. The lawyer who took their case, Rebecca Sloan, had heard dozens of horror stories about HOAs trying to extort residents. But she said this was among the most extreme, especially the part about Karen's alleged vandalism claim. Rebecca was confident they had a solid defense. Still, she warned them that the HOA's next step would be official court proceedings, and once it reached that point, anything could happen. And so, Henry and Martha braced themselves. The once peaceful nights of sipping tea on the porch were gone. They mentally prepared for what was shaping up to be a nasty legal battle, one that would see the inside of a courtroom. And perhaps most shocking, Karen seemed hell-bent on using every resource at her disposal to push them out. All over 2 silly pink flamingos and an outrageous appetite for power. Little did they know, the real nightmare was yet to unfold. The day of the HOA's special hearing arrived, held in the neighborhood's community center, a beige, boxy building where people usually played bingo or gathered for potlucks. But this time, the folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a long table with 5 stern-looking board members. Karen sat at the center, tapping her manicured nails on a stack of documents. Henry, Martha, and their lawyer Rebecca sat on the opposite side. It was an odd scene. Neighbors hovered at the back of the room, hushed and tense as though they were about to watch a live courtroom drama. Karen opened the proceedings by reading a lengthy list of the alleged violations committed by Henry and Martha. Many were trivial: overflowing trash once, a small potted plant placed too close to the walkway, and so on. But the one that caught everyone's attention was the accusation of trespass and vandalism. According to Karen, she had security footage of Henry tearing down a sign on her lawn. She claimed that, upon confronting him, he'd cursed her out. She even said she feared for her life. The board members exchanged concerned glances. Rebecca raised her hand to speak. She explained that Henry was nowhere near Karen's property on the day of the alleged incident. He'd been at a doctor's appointment, and she had documentation proving it. Furthermore, the so-called security footage had yet to be shown to anyone, including the police. Karen bristled, insisting she'd already turned the footage over to the authorities, but there was no record of it in the police reports. The board deliberated behind closed doors for about 10 minutes. When they returned, Karen delivered their decision in a clipped tone. The board would uphold the violations and fines, with an added stipulation that Henry and Martha must apologize publicly for community disruption within 5 days. Otherwise, the HOA would move forward with a lien on their home. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. Even the board members who sat with Karen looked uneasy. Suddenly, one of the neighbors, a retired Air Force veteran named Cecil, spoke up. He'd always been known for his calm demeanor and fair judgment. "This is insane," he said loudly. "These folks haven't done anything wrong. Those flamingos have been on their lawn for years without a peep of trouble." Karen tried to gavel him into silence, but Cecil ignored her. He turned to the board. "I demand to see this so-called evidence right now." Karen's eyes flickered. She launched into a rehearsed speech about respecting the authority of the HOA leadership. But Cecil wouldn't relent. More neighbors joined in, demanding Karen show the footage or produce proof. Murmurs escalated into shouts. "We're tired of this nonsense. She's making stuff up. Where's the evidence?" 2 board members, clearly uncomfortable, glanced over at the stack of documents in front of Karen. One of them quietly asked if the footage was in her binder. Karen stammered, flipping through pages as if searching for something. She finally snapped the binder shut and announced, "That footage is with the police. It's not my responsibility to prove anything here." The tension in the room was palpable. It was obvious to many that Karen might be bluffing about the vandalism video. Despite the uproar, the HOA formally demanded Henry and Martha remove the flamingos and pay the fines. Rebecca coolly stated that her clients would challenge the entire matter in real court. She was filing for an injunction immediately. Karen's face turned bright red. "You have no idea what kind of legal battle you're stepping into," she hissed. "The HOA has resources beyond your wildest dreams. I'm going to make sure you're bankrupt by the time this is over." With that, she gathered her papers and stormed out. What followed was an uneasy stalemate. Henry and Martha refused to remove their flamingos or pay a dime. They continued about their daily lives, though each day felt overshadowed by mounting tension. They received more letters, threatening higher fines and allusions to further police action. Neighbors rallied around them, some offering to pitch in for legal expenses. Some even placed discreet pink flamingo ornaments in their own yards as a sign of solidarity. This enraged Karen Moore, who, in a bizarre move, started dropping off new violation notices to half the community. Everything from the wrong color mulch to unauthorized bird feeders became reasons for citation. Days later, Henry and Martha woke at 6 a.m. to a commotion outside. A tow truck was hauling away Henry's 1998 Lincoln Town car, parked in their driveway. Two uniformed security guards, apparently hired by Karen, cited blatant violations of the new vehicle policy. Furious and frightened, Martha called the local sheriff. Within half an hour, 2 deputies arrived. They were as confused as Henry and Martha. One deputy flipped through the thick HOA rulebook, concluding the policy about 5-year or newer vehicles was not legally enforceable unless it had been voted on by the entire association. It hadn't. The tow truck driver had no legitimate authorization to remove the car. After a heated exchange, the driver unhooked the Lincoln and left, clearly upset at having been caught in the middle of a shady situation. The incident only galvanized the neighbors further. A meeting was held at Cecil's house, where nearly 24 residents shared stories of Karen's harassment. One family had been threatened with a $1,000 fine for putting up a holiday wreath 3 days before Christmas. Another had been slapped with multiple citations for poor lawn health, even though they hired the same landscapers the HOA used for common areas. It became obvious that Karen was leveraging her position to strong-arm people she disliked. And now, with the Henry and Martha situation hitting a fever pitch, she was desperate to make an example of them. Shortly afterward, Henry and Martha's lawyer Rebecca received confirmation that a court date was set. The HOA was suing them for unpaid fines and alleged defamation. Karen claimed their baseless accusations were tarnishing the HOA's reputation. Meanwhile, Henry and Martha, with Rebecca's help, were countersuing for harassment, emotional distress, and wrongful lien threats. Word spread fast. Half the neighborhood was ready to testify in support of Henry and Martha. Some who had previously stayed silent decided it was time to speak up. Karen, however, wasn't backing down. She doubled down on her allegations, insisting she had the footage of Henry's supposed vandalism and that the neighbors would regret siding against her. Rumors flew. Some folks speculated Karen had doctored some random video to frame Henry. Others whispered that she might have a personal grudge. Someone claimed Karen's mother had once lived in the neighborhood and had a long-standing rivalry with Martha, though no one could confirm it. All anyone knew was that tensions were at a boiling point, and soon a real judge would decide if Henry and Martha would lose their home. The entire community braced for fireworks in the courthouse. Little did they realize that what happened next would shake Foxglove Estates to its very core, and expose a side of Karen that no one had anticipated. The sun shone harshly the morning of the court date, as though illuminating the tension sitting in everyone's chests. The small county courthouse was packed. Henry and Martha sat beside Rebecca, stiff with a mixture of nerves and resolve. Behind them, nearly 20 neighbors had come to show support. On the opposing bench, Karen strutted in wearing a crisp suit, armed with 2 lawyers paid for by the HOA. She offered a curt glance at Henry and Martha and then took her seat with an air of superiority. Proceedings began. Karen's lead attorney laid out the HOA's grievances, painting Henry and Martha as aggressive violators of community standards, incorrigible in their disregard for HOA rules. He also recited a bizarre claim that the pink flamingos undermined the property values in Foxglove Estates, insinuating that Henry and Martha were costing their neighbors thousands of dollars by clinging to tacky ornaments. The argument seemed flimsy. The judge, a gray-haired man in his 60s, kept a neutral expression. Rebecca rose to present Henry and Martha's side. She skillfully dismantled the allegations about property values with documented neighborhood sales that showed no depreciation. She then dove into the crux of the matter: the harassment, fabricated evidence, and improper fines. Exhibit after exhibit displayed the ever-changing HOA rulebook, showing how Karen had revised regulations unilaterally. Rebecca handed the judge copies of threatening letters signed by Karen, all filled with ominous warnings. When it came time to address the vandalism accusation, Karen sat up straighter. "Your Honor," she said in a polished tone, "I have definitive video proof that Mr. Henry trespassed on my property to remove an HOA sign." She turned to her attorneys, who produced a flash drive. The court clerk set up a screen and inserted the drive. The footage was grainy, showing a figure in a ball cap tugging at a sign. The angle was poor, and the image blurred. At first glance, it did appear to be an older man. But as the video played, Rebecca asked the clerk to pause. The person on the screen had a distinct limp that Henry did not have. He'd played tennis weekly until his knee surgery the previous year, but it hardly gave him a limp that pronounced. Moreover, the figure was wearing a jacket with large lettering on the back, something Henry had never owned. It was suspicious enough that even the judge raised an eyebrow. Rebecca then produced a time-stamped security camera photo from a local pharmacy that placed Henry 10 miles away during the alleged vandalism incident. The judge looked from the photo to the shaky video. "Ms. Wilmorn," he addressed Karen, "can you explain this discrepancy?" Karen fumbled for words. Her attorney cleared his throat, mentioning human error and circumstantial evidence. But before they could spin a defense, Rebecca pressed a final button. She'd subpoenaed the tech specialist from the police department who had examined the video at the sheriff's request. He testified that the footage's metadata showed it had been heavily edited. The judge glanced sharply at Karen, who sat frozen, her expression unreadable. Whispers rippled through the audience. Once the evidence of tampering was laid bare, the judge sighed and removed his reading glasses. "I don't appreciate people trying to manipulate the court," he said with measured calm. He then turned to Henry and Martha. "I'm inclined to dismiss these claims of vandalism." Karen's face reddened. She tried to sputter a response, but the judge held up a hand. "I'm not finished." Rebecca proceeded with the counterclaims, presenting instance after instance of malicious fines, threats, and emotional distress. Several neighbors stood up to testify, describing how Karen had intimidated them into silence. One older gentleman recounted having to remove a small wooden ramp he'd built for his wife's wheelchair because Karen said it clashed with the community's architectural aesthetic. Another woman revealed that Karen had once threatened to foreclose on her home if she didn't rip out a patch of wildflowers she'd planted to honor a deceased friend. With each testimonial, Karen's lawyers appeared more flustered, flipping through papers as though a piece of evidence might magically exonerate their client. The judge called for a brief recess. Henry and Martha's supporters buzzed in the hallway, hopeful yet anxious. Meanwhile, Karen huddled with her attorneys, gesturing wildly. Her composure was cracking, and it was obvious to anyone within earshot that she was blaming them for not fixing the situation. At one point, she seemed to glance Henry's way, her eyes filled with a sudden panic. No longer the haughty president who strutted around handing out fines, but a cornered bully. Back in session, the judge delivered his decision. First, he declared all fines against Henry and Martha null and void. Furthermore, he ordered the HOA to pay restitution for any legal fees the couple incurred due to the frivolous lawsuit. The Flamingos? They could stay right where they were. Neighbors broke into spontaneous applause, which the judge quickly quieted with a polite admonition. Then came the bombshell. The judge announced that, given the evidence of tampering and the numerous credible witness testimonies, he was referring Karen's actions for possible criminal charges, including fraud and perjury. Karen's eyes widened in horror. Her attorneys exchanged grim looks. While the judge didn't have the power to arrest her on the spot, his referral meant the district attorney would review her actions for criminal prosecution. This was more than a slap on the wrist. This was the potential end of Karen's days as HOA president, and possibly the beginning of a legal nightmare for her personally. In the corridor outside, neighbors gathered in support of Henry and Martha, cheering, hugging, and offering congratulations. Rebecca couldn't hide a victorious smile. Henry, normally soft-spoken, dabbed at tears. Martha held his hand and shook her head, marveling at how something so innocent, two pink flamingos, had turned into a saga that nearly uprooted their entire life. Karen, meanwhile, stormed out a side exit to avoid the throng of people. According to later rumors, she tried to file an immediate appeal to block the judge's orders. She got nowhere. Over the next few months, the HOA's board was forced to hold a special election to replace her. Long-buried complaints about her leadership style surged forward. Karen found herself exposed. Her manipulative tactics, aggressive rulemaking, and lack of transparency with HOA funds were all under scrutiny. There were even whispers that she might have misappropriated some of the HOA budget. By the end of the year, Foxglove Estates was under a new president, Cecil, the retired Air Force veteran, who vowed to restore the sense of community Karen had nearly destroyed. One of his first acts was to pass a grandfather clause for harmless personal lawn decorations, like Henry and Martha's Flamingos, and to ensure that any major rule changes had to pass a community-wide vote. As for Karen, she left the neighborhood quietly one evening, hauling her possessions into a moving truck. No one really knew where she went. The district attorney's investigation lingered, though neighbors seldom heard updates. But in truth, most people were content simply to have their peaceful, if sometimes mundane, retirement community back.